I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the photographs, I see the critics and people who recognize it in the street.
She kept saying his name, even at the end, even when he had given her almost nothing to hold on to. Audrey Hepburn spent 6 decades being asked about husbands, co-stars, and lovers who adored her, and in her final interviews she kept circling back to a man most of the public barely knew existed. He wasn't a leading man. He wasn't one of the 2 husbands she married and divorced. He was her father, and understanding why she never let him go changes the way her entire life reads. For most of the world, Audrey Hepburn is frozen in a handful of images: the black Givenchy dress, the tiara in Roman Holiday, the effortless poise that made her seem untouched by hardship. That image was a performance, carefully maintained, and behind it sat a woman shaped by abandonment before she ever stepped in front of a camera. Biographer Donald Spoto, author of Enchantment, The Life of Audrey Hepburn, interviewed people who had known her personally, and his research points to one relationship as the emotional foundation for everything that followed. Not a marriage. Not a romance. Her relationship with her father, Joseph Rustin. Rustin was English by nationality, restless by temperament, and for a period in the 1930s, an open sympathizer of fascist politics. He and Audrey's mother, the Dutch Baroness Ella van Heemstra, traveled to Nazi Germany, attended rallies, and aligned themselves with a movement that would soon plunge Europe into catastrophe. Their daughter, born in Brussels in 1929, absorbed none of that ideology, but she absorbed something else from those years, the sense that the adults responsible for her were oriented towards something other than her. In 1935, when Audrey was 6, Rustin left the family entirely and relocated to London. He remained legally entitled to visit her, and for a stretch of her childhood she waited for those visits at boarding school in Kent while classmates went home for the holidays. He rarely came. Robert Matzen, author of Dutch Girl, Audrey Hepburn and World War II, draws on wartime records and family correspondence to describe this as the moment Audrey learned that love could exist in name only, that a parent could hold a title without holding its responsibilities. That lesson would resurface, in different forms, throughout her adult life. What followed made the wound deeper. Believing the Netherlands would be safer than England as war approached, her mother sent her to live with relatives in Arnhem. Instead, Audrey lived through the German occupation of a country that offered no safety at all. She was 10 when the invasion came, and by her early teens she had adopted a Dutch alias, Etta van Heemstra, to obscure her English identity from occupying forces. 2 uncles were executed by the Nazis in 1942, and after that, according to Matzen's research, something shifted in her. She began quietly assisting the Dutch resistance, carrying messages and underground newspapers in her shoes, performing silent ballet at secret fundraisers where no one dared applaud for fear of being overheard. By the winter of 1944, the German blockade had triggered a famine across the occupied Netherlands. Audrey's family survived on tulip bulbs and whatever else could be found. She developed anemia, respiratory illness, and malnutrition so severe that doctors later pointed to that period as a lasting influence on her health. When liberation finally arrived, a relief worker with the organization that would later become UNICEF handed her a piece of chocolate. She spoke about that moment for the rest of her life, not as a small kindness, but as evidence that strangers could offer what family had failed to provide. Against this backdrop, her adult relationships take on a different shape. In 1954, she married the actor and director Mel Ferrer, a man 13 years her senior who quickly took an active role in shaping her career and public image. What began as guidance slowly hardened into control. Sean Hepburn Ferrer, her son, describes in his memoir Audrey Hepburn, an elegant spirit, a dynamic where her own instincts were gradually pushed aside. She endured 2 miscarriages during those years, including one after a serious fall from a horse while filming The Unforgiven in 1959, before finally giving birth to Sean in 1960. She stepped away from acting for a full year to devote herself to motherhood, but the strain in the marriage never eased. Rumors of Ferrer's temper, jealousy, and eventually infidelity on both sides followed the couple for years. The marriage limped on for 14 years before ending in 1968, and Audrey walked away emotionally drained but, for the first time in a long while, free. Before that marriage even began, there had been another man, one whose importance is often underestimated. On the set of Sabrina in 1954, she formed a genuine and reportedly intense connection with her co-star William Holden. The set was already strained, with Humphrey Bogart resentful that the lead had gone to Audrey rather than his wife, Lauren Bacall. Holden, by contrast, was drawn to her immediately, and the closeness deepened into a real relationship away from the cameras. He proposed marriage. She refused him, not out of ambivalence, but because Holden had undergone a vasectomy and she wanted, more than almost anything, to become a mother. It was a painful, clear-eyed decision, and biographer Barry Paris, in his book simply titled Audrey Hepburn, notes that Holden never fully recovered from the loss. Neither, in her own quieter way, did she. The relationship revealed how deliberately she was already building her life around the family she had never had. Her second marriage, to the Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti, began in 1969 with the same hopeful intensity as her first. They met on a Mediterranean cruise and married within 6 months. She moved to Rome, gave birth to her second son, Luca, in 1970, and tried to build the private domestic life she had always wanted, stepping back almost entirely from Hollywood in the process. Dotti's repeated and highly publicized infidelities made that impossible. Italian tabloids tracked his affairs openly, and the marriage that was supposed to offer sanctuary instead placed her under a different kind of public scrutiny, one she had specifically tried to escape by leaving her film career behind. She stayed longer than many expected, partly for Luca and partly because she was not someone who abandoned commitments easily, but the combination of betrayal and constant exposure eventually made the marriage untenable. It ended in 1982, leaving her, according to those close to her at the time, more guarded than she had ever been. It was only afterward, retreating to her farmhouse in Tolkienaz, Switzerland, a home she called La Paisible, meaning the peaceful one, that she found real peace. She turned down major film roles, avoided the social circuit, and lived quietly among neighbors who knew her simply as a woman who said good morning at the local market. There she met Robert Wolders, a Dutch-born actor recently widowed after the long illness of his wife, actress Marital Oberon. They met at a charity auction in the late 1970s, and what began as a brief, unremarkable exchange grew into daily phone calls and eventually, a deep and lasting partnership. Their relationship, which lasted until her death, was notably free of the control that had defined her first marriage and the instability that had defined her second. She introduced him as her husband despite never formally marrying him, a detail that speaks to how little she needed institutional validation by that point in her life. What she needed was steadiness, and for over a decade, Wolders provided it. That same decade brought her into her most significant public role, as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador beginning in 1988, after she found herself speaking without a script at a charity concert about hunger, occupation, and what it meant to be a child in wartime. A senior UNICEF official in the audience offered her a full ambassadorship before the evening was over. She accepted, and the years that followed took her to Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, and El Salvador, sitting with malnourished children in conditions that echoed, in eerie detail, her own childhood in wartime Holland. Those who traveled with her, including Wolders, described her approach not as charity performed by a celebrity, but as something closer to repayment, a debt she felt toward the version of herself who had once been handed a chocolate bar by a stranger after liberation. It is difficult to separate that instinct from the abandonment she carried from childhood. She had spent much of her life being the one who was left behind. In her final years, she made herself the one who stayed. Diagnosed with a rare and aggressive appendiceal cancer, pseudomyxoma peritonia, in 1992, after returning from a UNICEF mission to Somalia, Audrey faced her prognosis with the same composure that had defined her adult life. Surgery was performed quickly, but the disease had already spread too far, and the diagnosis was terminal. Friends recalled that her chief regret was not fear of death, but the humanitarian work she would be unable to finish. Her longtime friend, the designer Hubert de Givenchy, who had dressed her for nearly 40 years, arranged a private flight to bring her home to Switzerland for her final weeks, since she was too fragile to travel commercially. She spent her final Christmas at La Paisible, and in a gesture those present described as quietly characteristic of her, she gave winter coats to the 3 men she felt closest to, Wolders, her son Sean, and Givenchy himself. She died at home on January 20th, 1993, surrounded by her sons and by Wolders. Her funeral, held at a small local church in Tolkienaz, was intimate, exactly as she would have wanted. Gregory Peck, her co-star from Roman Holiday 4 decades earlier, read one of her favorite poems. And yet, in the years leading up to that death, when journalists asked about the people who had shaped her, she did not dwell primarily on her husbands or on Holden. She returned, again and again, to her father. In the 1960s she had tracked Joseph Rustin down through the Red Cross and found him living quietly in Dublin, indifferent to the reunion she had spent decades imagining. He offered her little warmth and no real explanation for the years of silence. She forgave him regardless, and supported him financially for the rest of his life, a detail biographers describe less as naivety and more as a lifelong, unresolved attempt to finally receive from him what he had never given. In interviews conducted near the end of her life, she spoke of him not with bitterness, which was never really in her nature, but with a kind of quiet, unanswered wondering, what he had been thinking, whether he had ever felt the absence the way she had, whether somewhere inside him there had been something he simply couldn't express. He died without ever giving her that answer. What Robert Wolders said of her afterward may be the most precise summary anyone has offered. It was not her beauty or her fame that defined her, he said, but her capacity to keep loving someone who had given her almost no reason to. She never stopped loving her father, and she never stopped grieving the fact that he had failed her. That contradiction, carried quietly across 7 decades, through occupation and marriage and motherhood and humanitarian work in the world's hardest places, may be the truest thing anyone has ever said about who Audrey Hepburn really was. She built a life around giving children the security she never had, and in doing so, she finally answered in her own way the question her father had left unresolved for as long as she lived. In the end, the woman the world remembered for grace and poise was, underneath it all, still the 6-year-old girl waiting at a school gate, still hoping someone would come.